Radical retrofit is really just pushing retrofit and kind of not assuming you have to knock down. You can actually create better and more interesting solutions. One of the architects from the 70s, they talk about long life, loose fits. You create buildings that can perhaps have different journeys through their time. They don't have to be immediately demolished. They can be kind of reused and reimagined. Alva Studios is a film studio, and we've built, I think, 5 or 6 film studios for them. I mean, many people would abandon that site, and it was a challenge, but we kept this old frame of a building, which is beautiful, and excavated underneath it, created a kind of higher, bigger space, which they needed for shooting. They needed a certain minimum height, and kind of created now a kind of world-leading event space and photo and film studio used by top fashion brands, photographers, etc.
In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schipp, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. In this episode, architect Jon Ackroyd talks about the radical retrofit philosophy, which focuses on reusing and reimagining old buildings instead of demolishing them. Inspired by the dyslexic architect Richard Rogers, Jon shares his journey and the founding of Akroyd Lowrie Architects. Discover how they use creative solutions and sustainable materials in projects like the Camberwell Magistrates Court retrofit. Plus, learn about their innovative use of VR in design and Jon's exciting vision for greener, denser cities in rewilded rural areas. So, welcome, Jon. I'm super excited to have you on Building Green today. You're managing director of Akroyd Lowrie, an award-winning London design studio with a strong focus on designing sustainable projects and shaping the cities of the future. Jon, I'd love to start by hearing your story. How did you get started in architecture and what led you to focus on creating sustainable urban spaces?
Thank you very much. It's great to be on the podcast. I guess my journey into architecture was a slightly unusual one, I suppose. I struggled at school and I didn't do well in exams and stuff, but I really enjoyed drawing. And later on, I found out that I was dyslexic. And basically I got interested in a GCSE art class in an architect called Richard Rogers, a famous British designer. And I found out that he was dyslexic, and because he was sort of a role model, I guess, seeing someone like that do it, I walked into his office one day about 25 years ago and asked for a job. And I got an internship working for Richard Rogers. And that's really my route in, was to kind of be inspired by someone and to find a kind of creative route into architecture.
That's super inspiring. Very beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. And that, I mean, Rogers has a big passion for sustainability. He sadly passed away in 2021, for those of you who know his work. But he was a kind of leading architect in the UK and globally, and really pushed forward with a lot of sustainable design projects, as well as rethinking the way much of London worked. Some of the new big transport and bridge infrastructure projects were all led by his kind of idealism and playful kind of nature. So yeah, he was a big inspiration and influence on my life, and he thought differently. And that's a kind of typical of a kind of a dyslexic. I'd originally saw it as a disadvantage, and then I think when I saw what Rogers had achieved, I realized that I could make a difference and use some of those skills that you get as a person that thinks differently to sort of make a positive impact on the world.
In what way do you think you come up with different solutions?
So dyslexics often struggle with words, writing, reading, but they often have very good three-dimensional and abilities to think around difficult problems. So take Rogers, for example. I mean, one of his most famous projects is the Pompidou Centre in Paris, that many people will know. And there, and in the Lloyd's of London building, he thought about taking all the services of a building that were normally kind of buried in the ceilings, everything else, and put them out on the outside of a building, so you could free up these wonderful open plan spaces. So he kind of turned thinking on its head. So that's what dyslexics are famous for, really, that they think a bit kind of unconventionally. So for me, I suppose that influenced some of the decisions I made in my life, which I can tell you a bit more about if you're interested, as the story develops.
Sure. Very cool. So now you're one of the co-founders of the London-based practice, Akroyd Lowrie. What was your founding manifest? Like, what were you trying to advocate for? And did you set a clear mission when you started?
I think we did, yeah. I mean, obviously, I'd had that background at working at Rogers and worked for a number of different sort of sustainable practices. And myself and my other co-founder, Oliver Lowrie, we worked at a practice called Archetype, who are a real leader in sustainability in the UK. And they had a very strong ethos around self-build, sustainable design, timber frame building, and we loved it. I really enjoyed working there. I've got a lot of admiration for the people that work there. And we did a kind of series of kind of studies and research on buildings in use. So going back and spending 2 or 3 years studying how a building performs in actuality versus what you think it might do before you design it. And that was funded by the government Technology Strategy Board. So we've kind of done a lot of heavy research. The frustration was that we often worked in these projects that are in the public sector where you have very little control as an architect. You're handed by the time it gets to the architect, you can kind of move a few things around, but the brief is set, the budget's set, the timescales are set. There's very little room for maneuver, and it's very kind of small. It's one project. You can't get the overview. So I think me and Ollie, when we founded, were really interested in having an impact on kind of city scale projects, and how could we take some of that learning from researching buildings and understanding them and kind of move that into a business environment where we could have influence on more people. So from our kind of very founding point, we looked to kind of engage with politicians, business people, other people, so that we could perhaps have a bigger impact than just the one building that we're designing. And I think, obviously we have a podcast, The Urban Forecast. We bring on politicians, thought leaders, everyone else, to try and kind of open up that debate. So, it's really important to design low energy buildings as a one-off, but actually you need to think about the wider ecosystem of the city, say London, for example, for us, but also looking at these new cities around the world that are booming at the moment, and are probably going to have the biggest effect on global warming and other kind of climate and environmental related matters, more than London and other developed cities that are a bit more stable, aren't growing quite as quickly as some of the cities in India, China, and say Nigeria.
So your firm is known for both retrofitting existing structures and constructing new ones, each with a focus on sustainability. Could you explain how your approach to sustainable and regenerative architecture varies between retrofitting a building and creating a new structure?
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally a specialist in retrofit. Ollie tends to do a bit more new builds, my business partner, but we both do a bit of both. I mean, I love retrofit. I love older buildings. They kind of have a real narrative. You can, as you understand the building better and you explore it, you can kind of create unusual and sort of exciting kind of things that come out of them. So I think our approach to sort of existing buildings is you've got to kind of understand them and understand their place and how they work. And that will really have impact on what you can do environmentally, because often some of the best things you can do is keep a lot of the structure, keep a lot of the things that are there. And you might not get to quite as lower energy performance as a new building, because you can't, for example, if it's a listed building, you can't kind of completely reconstruct the facades or things like that, but you can keep a lot of the structure, a lot of the beauty, a lot of the interest, and save an enormous amount of carbon in the building that's kept. But each retrofit is a slightly different case, and we as a practice are very interested in place-specific architecture. So even when we do new builds, we spend a lot of time kind of trying to understand the location, the materials, the people that live there, and kind of really understand that, which we think is very kind of important. So another retrofit we're doing at the moment is called Camberwell Magistrates Court down in the south of London. It's a big, huge 1970s concrete building, and we're going to keep all the structure but completely remove the facade that's got flammable materials. It's not in great condition. It doesn't perform. So that is actually going to be a fantastically performing environmental building, and it's going to create something like 140 new homes, a hotel, new public space with a plaza in front of it. So that's a kind of really exciting one where we can actually have a big environmental impact as well as really reducing the embodied energy in the building. And then, on new builds, there's an opportunity to start from scratch and kind of really work with, say, the orientation. So the way the sun goes, where you put it, how you place it. And you sometimes don't have those kind of opportunities on an existing building. So at the basis, we always look at the site and try and understand the brief, the people, the context and the environment. But you slightly have different responses. You have got a bit more opportunities, I suppose, to do what you want on new builds, but on older and retrofit buildings, you often get more creative and innovative solutions because the constraints are so difficult. You have to work round things that you wouldn't necessarily ideally want there, but then you get kind of quite quirky and interesting and successful buildings.
Do you sometimes, when you start a new project, I know how it is for us. So often a client would come to us like, here is a building we have, like a place we own, show us what we can do with it. And then we usually make a few sketches between the maximum in terms of volume and costs you could get from it if you retrofit, but also if you build a new one or if you build an extension. Do you also compare like the environmental impact of such options?
Yes, definitely. I think in London particularly, there's also a lot of emphasis in policy, as well as us as sort of architects. There's a big kind of push, and which we're part of, to kind of keep existing fabric where you can. So I think we do analysis, for example, the Camberwell Magistrates Court project. There was a previous firm looking at it, and they were going to demolish the whole building. It's got a 9-meter deep basement, a huge concrete structure. If you can imagine, if you remove that, just the act of doing that is a vast investment in carbon. So our engineering team we were working with did an analysis, and we went forward to the council and said, look, this is what we'd like to do in the kind of pre-application kind of engagement that we do in the UK. And they were very supportive of that retention of the building and reduction in the carbon. And overall, I think financially it's more viable than because obviously taking it down and removing that all and then building it. So that there is both a sort of sustainable and a financial argument. That's not always the case. Sometimes it can be cheaper to take things down. But yeah, we always tend to do a capacity or feasibility study at the start, like you said, and we'll use different metrics to analyze that, both kind of area, volume, embodied and operational kind of energy targets that we're kind of looking at for those projects. Increasingly in our work, one of the things I'm quite passionate about and is the sort of biodiversity aspect of it as well. So it's not just the carbon that's being used in the building's operation through heating or cooling, or the energy that's in the concrete or the structure of the building, but it's also actually the carbon you can sequester effectively, you can take out of the environment by either using products like timber, which we're a big fan of, when it's appropriate, using timber, because obviously trees will absorb carbon when they're grown, but also the design of the kind of landscape spaces to really encourage trees to be put back. We've just got consented 140 homes in the south of London, and what we've done there is we've kind of introduced over 150 new trees, a kind of play area, outside play facility, and that we're kind of trying to put back almost 20% more nature than was there before on this site. So there's a lot of work that goes into that, and there's new policies in the UK called biodiversity net gain, which actually gives some useful measures for kind of assessing, are you making a positive impact with the number of trees, the type of species that you're introducing to that area. And I think that's an increasingly important thing with the biodiversity crisis that's facing us, as well as the climate crisis.
Yeah. In that project you were talking about before, the retrofitting project that you're excited about, do you have numbers in mind of the comparison between the carbon you would
The carbon we save, yes.
Yeah.
I can't remember it off my head, but it was thousands of tons, and I can dig it out. But there was analysis done of the relative carbon saving for basically demolishing that building and then or retaining that structure and rebuilding it. So yeah, we worked with it. It was an structural engineering firm that worked with us to produce those figures, and they kind of estimated how much, because there's a huge volume of cubic concrete and the amount of carbon in each cubic meter of concrete, how much we're keeping, how much we're removing, and then the relative impact. So yeah, yes, we did do that, and I can probably dig it out for you if you're interested.
Yeah, it would be cool. So you talk about concrete and wood. Have you played around with more innovative materials?
Yeah, we've done a lot. I mean, we've used pretty much most different types of building systems, from cross-laminated timber, which is kind of giant plywood glued together to create buildings, to off-site volumetric building, on-site kind of building frames, 3D printed elements, kind of all of those different kind of modern methods of construction. MMC, it's often referred to in the UK. There's been challenges in that market recently in the UK, unfortunately. I don't know if you followed the press, but quite a few of the manufacturers of off-site production have gone bust in the UK since sort of post-COVID. So that's been tough. And I think post-Grenfell, which some of your international listeners may not be so related to, but there was a terrible fire in West London it was about 7 years ago now, I think. But it was really terrible, and 70 people passed away. And that's completely changed the way construction's being done in the UK. And there's been a kind of comprehensive review, and there is therefore some cynicism in some parts about using off-site construction, even though I think it can be better, and I think timber can be better. It's also making sure the justification is there. So there are some challenges to those systems. I think in individuals' homes, it's normally relatively easy. It's not always cheaper, but it can be quite efficient, and you get much nicer, cleaner details. So Archetype, I mentioned before, who are real pioneers in the UK of using passive house design, which I think some of your listeners may be familiar with, but it's super low energy design. And where you use sort of timber frame there, you can get really nice, tight, neat construction, not messy kind of on-site construction. And you can achieve really, really impressive performance with passive house design. So yeah, we've used many of them, and we're excited to try out new ones as they come.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to someone who's used like these types of concrete that they are currently working on that are more sustainable, more carbon friendly and everything.
I can maybe find you some engineers that do it. So we have used some concretes that have kind of ash and lime and different levels of which are kind of recycled kind of aggregates within the concrete to reduce the overall. The energy in concrete is always pretty high though, because of the cement content, and so cement is really, really carbon intensive, but concrete lasts a long time. So there are some benefits to it. I think one of the exciting things, actually, I should mention, is a chap called Steve Gilchrist, who's worth looking up. He looks at recycled steel. So they're doing a big project in London, the UK, and working with, I think it's Grosvenor, one of the big estates in London anyway, where they actually taking steel from other sites, getting it tested, and then re-erecting it within new buildings. Because as try as we might, we'll always end up needing a bit of steel here or there because it's such a useful building material. But actually, if we can start to kind of standardize the use of steel members, etc., regulate them, check that they're still working, and then put them back in without having to retake them back to the factory, that's really exciting. And that is actually happening. So it might be an interesting person to talk to on the podcast.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting.
Yeah.
Will be great. So you've also mentioned 3D printing. What have you used that for? And what are the challenges there?
There's quite a lot of challenges. We've used a lot of kind of it for prototyping and kind of printing and model making and those kind of activities. We were quite interested in kind of firms in the Holland, like 3DMX, which we went over and saw, and their kind of robotic arms building or bridges. We found that we haven't quite got them to work with UK regulation. So the problem is to actually get things approved by the sort of structural and fire authorities, et cetera, is extremely difficult. So where we do sort of pro bono projects. So one of the interesting projects that we're working on at the moment is for an urban farm in Dagenham, which is a sort of outer London borough, with quite a lot of kind of social challenges, etc. But there's a farm there that's dedicated to regenerative farming and sort of educating young people in basically the problems with using fertilizers and everything else and trying to move away from that. And there we're building them a new education centre as a pro bono project. And there we're kind of looking to really push kind of innovative materials, and we'll be looking to use hempcrete, one of, you may have come across as a material, and various other kind of reused and recycled steel. So I think sometimes you have to use exemplar projects where you can test things. With the bigger projects, when you're building 150 homes in central London, you can't always take the risks. Well, you can't take the risks because, there's various insurance, fire, regulative factors. So you kind of have to use exemplar test projects where the client's aware of the risks and happy to do those risks because it's suitable there, and then try to bring that into the mainstream.
So you've overseen bigger and smaller projects, from urban planning at the waterfront to big residential projects to school and even a houseboat. What is your through line in your approach to projects, whether it's a small development or a big neighborhood master plan?
I think it goes back to that place-specific architecture. I think for us, each place has its own special elements, and I think you look to work with those, and they tend to be the actual location physically, the people that are there, the brief, and everything else, and you put those together. And the aim of a good architect, I think, is to become, more than the sum of its parts. A building. So a building's obviously got to have a number of rooms and staircases and toilets and all the kind of functional parts. But I think if you can kind of create something that's special, it's where all of those things do something a bit more, and people gain a sense of place. And that's normally where it kind of actually has some kind of meaning. And it's normally the people that put the meaning there, but you have to kind of create a frame for it. So you have to be kind of sensitive to what's there, both environmentally, people-wise, historically. And if you can do that and understand, it doesn't matter whether it's someone's small house extension, a school, a library, or a public square. Does it have relevance? Does it make sense to people that live there? Does it have some recognition of the history and the orientation and the environment? And then that kind of frame can allow people to make it their own.
I'm also intrigued by your commitment to radical retrofit, as you call it as well. Could you share a project that exemplifies this approach and the impact it has had on both the building's functionality and the community around it?
There's a number. So, radical retrofit is really just pushing retrofit and kind of not assuming you have to knock down. You can actually create kind of better and more interesting solutions. Retrofit will always often involve small elements of new build to kind of create things that are interesting. But the Camberwell Magistrates Court project I mentioned there is very interesting. It's something you might assume a brutalist 1970s building that is perhaps unpopular with many, that is no longer got a viable function. The government didn't need to use it anymore. It's sitting there empty for, I think, best part of a decade. So converting that back into something that has meaning is very, very exciting, while keeping a lot of the frame. I think one of the architects from the 70s, who I forget which name it is, but they talk about long life, loose fits. You create buildings that can perhaps have different journeys through their time. They don't have to be immediately demolished. They can be kind of reused and reimagined. We're doing a couple of Alva Studios is a film studio, and we've built, I think, 5 or 6 film studios for them. And we took a kind of coachworks in just near King's Cross in central London, and kind of completely, many people would abandon that site. And it was a challenge, but we kept this old frame of a building, which is beautiful, with not kind of pitched roof lights, and excavated underneath it, created a kind of higher, bigger space, which they needed for shooting. They needed a certain minimum height, and kind of created a kind of world leading kind of event space and photo and film studio that's kind of used by top fashion brands, photographers, etc. So that, seeing something that's kind of this empty shell and used as a kind of thing to becoming a kind of cultural centre. That's really, really exciting.
A few of you might know that I recently opened my own architecture studio, and I just started with the podcast. I'm very excited to build a platform where I connect with inspiring people to learn along the way and share these learnings with you. So if any little thing has inspired you, or if you learned anything new, I'd appreciate if you could rate the show or share my content on social media, Spotify or YouTube or wherever you listen to it. And if you think there are any touch points between you and me, I'd be super happy to connect with you. Feel free to reach out on any platform. Yeah, I wanted to ask you before, when you said concrete has also its advantages because it lasts very long. How do you ensure your buildings are like flexible for future retrofits?
Yeah, I think I think it's a really important thing that I think we need to think about. You need to think about your building in 100 years' time. What does it look like? And, we can't exactly know, but can you imagine how it might be reused? So while I'm a big supporter of timber and structure and in internal kind of finishes, I love timber. I have and previous practice I've used a lot of timber on the outside of buildings. I think that's less successful unless it's treated in certain ways, because it starts to rot and degrade, and particularly in urban environments where there's pollution. So I think there has been a journey, and part of it's going back and looking at the performance, as I mentioned, of buildings that you've done. So I think architects sometimes quite like the pretty picture at the end, but then what happens in 5 years or how the users use it, I think is a really important aspect of thinking about projects. I think for us, it's trying to kind of think about buildings that are, you mentioned concrete. I do think it has a place. It is trying to reduce the carbon in it. But I mean, the buildings that were built by Romans and kind of, other kind of ancient were often stone. So having solid, massive things that actually stay can be quite powerful, and they are often very fire resistant and very strong. So I think having cores and bases of very strong materials, trying to reduce the carbon content in that, and then using timber and other buildings materials within that can be it. Steel, I think, is a particularly a material that can be used well with timber, and that can be recycled. So rather than recycling, i.e. taking it, melting it down and starting from fresh, we should be looking at these as component parts that you can have within your information that's handed over at the end of the building, and then they can be demounted, reused, reassembled, and flexibly reused. And interestingly, in the UK, we're having a big change in our fire regs that I mentioned, and one of the things that they're now talking about a lot is the golden thread, which is this idea of a narrative of, particularly around fire safety, but around kind of keeping the history of the building alive, so that, say, for example, there's a renovation project, or if there's a fire incident, that they know, because often the information gets lost and no one really knows, and they have to kind of, and trying to keep that alive. So I think within trying to do building safety and fire protection better, there's actually opportunities for sustainability. So, because having good information and understanding those buildings means you can reimagine them, and in keeping those sort of, we have the kind of BIM files and the specifications, and keeping them all on an online cloud, so that you can actually go back and adapt that building in 20, 30 years time and know exactly what's in there.
Yeah, talking about BIM and 3D models and everything, I saw you've also used virtual reality in your design process. Could you share how this technology has transformed client engagements and the final output of your projects? Do you think it helps make projects more sustainable because clients know what to expect, and some three-dimensional corners can be solved before the building process starts, and material can be saved or anything?
Absolutely. I mean, this goes back to the point I made before, is when you go back and study buildings after the event, it's a bit late. You find out what doesn't work, but it's very expensive to change it and difficult. The benefit of 3D modeling, virtual reality modeling, so actually going inside in one-to-one, is you can test them before they're built. And that is something that hasn't really been possible till very recently. So walking, particularly with schools and end users, kind of taking them around and actually getting into those spaces and making them think about how they would start their day, where the children would come in, where they'd wash their hands. And we've got it set up in the office downstairs. We've got kind of multiple headsets, so you can have the head teacher, one of the teachers, an architect, an engineer, all in the same virtual environment, and they walk round. And then often you can find there's things that are not needed there. So I think, sometimes sustainability is not doing things is the most sustainable solution. So all aspects of building has a sort of, even the environmental ones tend to have a carbon impact because you'll have to build something or make something. Sometimes I think mistakes can be made if you don't test them enough. And people like architects and engineers are so used to looking at plans and drawings and even 3D models. And so they forget that people that are working and living in these buildings who really deeply care, but don't necessarily have the familiarity with plans and technical specifications. But if they go in a headset and they could walk in there like, whoa, what's that doing there? I don't like that. How would that work? That doesn't work. I would, and I think it brings it into their head. So I think it really does help, rather than deciding you don't like something when you walk into it on day one when it's built. You can kind of problem solve much, much earlier on in the process. So yes, it's a very powerful tool. And yeah, we use it with many of our clients. Also with planning officers, we've managed to convince so that they were worried about the height of a building, for example. And sometimes architectural elevations can be a bit misleading. And visuals are, at one angle, but if you can actually put them in the model and they can, walk up and down the high street that they know and then compare and go, actually, you can't even see it. It's not a big deal. We have had a couple of successes in getting kind of more height in appropriate locations with using the VR tools.
That's very cool. That's something I also always struggle with. Like some laws don't really make sense, but you have to follow them and yeah, then you have to draw out an elevation that nobody's ever going to see in real life, but it's judged by that elevation. So I think there is like a huge change that's going to happen there, or I guess.
I think so. Definitely. I mean, already in the UK, we have kind of verified views. So you have to have certain 3D views that are independently verified. So it's not me just fudging my model or whatever to make it look, but often you're absolutely right. Elevations are highly misleading and they're useful tools for certain things, but you never look at it. You never see it, especially the taller buildings that we're doing. So I think kind of seeing it within its actual city context or environmental context is absolutely fundamental. And those tools of modeling are now, we're doing a lot of work with kind of AI, and how we can, simplify some of the processes that we're doing. And it's a kind of, being honest with AI, it's slightly scary, some of the things that it's possible to do with it, but also it's huge potential. So the things that I've grown up doing as a kind of architect, kind of doing door schedules, window schedules, toilet schedules, all these kind of slightly mundane things when you're a junior, probably won't be the same kind of necessity. And even feasibility studies we were talking about earlier, doing kind of quick carbon, studies, quick area studies can be done in a couple of clicks of a button. But I think what I've seen is it doesn't replace competency. It doesn't replace critical thinking. And I think those tools have made big problems actually having investigated them more, but it does take away some of the grunt work. So I think it's exciting that we might be able to get more sustainable solutions by kind of focusing on that critical thinking. Can we avoid doing things? Can we do things cheaper? Can we do things better? And not spending a whole time kind of producing sort of teams of material. So yeah, it's an exciting place.
Yeah, I always like to look at AI like an intern. Like it does a lot of stuff for you, but you always have to be there and be the critical mind behind it. And I'm wondering how it's going to be in like 20 years, because I still also had to learn how to draw manually. I never understood why, but I think students nowadays are even gonna wonder more why they have to draw manually, and they are probably not going to learn it. I'm wondering what's going to happen with that critical thinking.
I think critical thinking is so important, and communication. So I think I've kind of, in COVID, obviously everyone was operating from home and on Zoom and Teams and other kind of communication, and that's carried through a bit. But what we're finding, there is no replacement for meeting people in real life and dealing with problems face to face. So there's a lot of studies that show that kind of, something like 60, I think, % of communication is body language. 30% is tone of voice, and 10% is the words or the content. And I think when you're dealing with very difficult, complex problems, having a kind of highly web-based solution often leads to more problems than solutions. So what I noticed coming back, and is that you had so many more meetings because everyone can fit in meetings. Oh dear, John, you don't need to come to over here. Let's just jump on a Zoom call. Let's jump on a Teams call. And actually, it wasn't efficient because people don't really, the difficult problems, they kind of slightly avoid sometimes in those environments. And it doesn't, half the people have turned their video off and are kind of emailing their best friend or girlfriend or whatever. And so you don't deal with problems. So I think, like you say about AI, it can be, it gets very useful, but can actually be a waste of time sometimes. And I think some of these technologies, we have to embrace them because they're happening. But I think we also have to embrace them with have we got much more efficient since BIM came in? Have we got much more efficient? Well, we need to use those tools carefully, and intelligently. And the same with Zoom and these communication tools are amazing, but they don't replace meeting up with people and 20 years of experience. Say, in the UK now, you can't build bigger buildings unless you can prove that you've delivered other big buildings over the last, your career, and you have to document and show the thinking that you've done. And it doesn't matter what piece of software you've got or what, thing, you have to show that there's competent human beings that are critically analyzing, because some of these models and things, they're great, but, they often make mistakes, and that humans can spot through kind of intelligent thinking. So yeah, it's an interesting space, but I think that's what I encourage people is that slowing down and getting organized and kind of critical thinking and communicating that can then lead to better design and more sustainable solutions.
Yeah, every solution comes with new problems. So in terms of urban planning, what impact do you think will post-COVID development have on our cities? Like, you mentioned more people are in home office. Are we going to build less office buildings, office areas within a city, more 15-minute cities because people are getting lazier in a way?
I think there's a big impact. We're seeing it kind of come through in our workflow. I mean, we're working on a number of projects in the City of London. That's the square mile at the centre of London, which is the historic Roman city, but it's typically the central business district. And, they're taking a more flexible approach where the sort of grade one top tier offices are renting really well, because it's a really nice location. But some of the stuff that's lower down the pecking order isn't renting as well. And they're not performing well environmentally. So the local authorities have their Vision 2040, where they want to see radical retrofit, real big change to some of that building stock to improve it, but they're encouraging different flexible uses. So hotels, student, residential, different uses. So you're seeing the city change a bit like we were talking about before. So things that were imagined as office blocks are now being changed into different things. So there is a big shift. We're also seeing we're doing projects on brownfield sites on the edge of London, sort of looking at sort of 300-400 new homes, really low energy sustainable homes on what were previous sort of big corporate offices. You often got big kind of out of town corporate offices for international companies, with masses of car parking and kind of, everyone would drive in, and we're looking at kind of reimagining those as sort of passive house, low energy, green communities, which then have their own co-working hub. So that two ends of the scale, one right in the centre of London, that's changing. There's still people coming in, but maybe they're coming in or if they're coming over from other countries, they come and stay for a couple of days and they maybe, go to the theatre and have food and try and use the city facilities. And that's what they want to encourage, a kind of more experiential based sort of city experience, not just turning up at work at 8 and leaving at 5:30 or whatever. And then on the edges of cities, you're getting kind of single, lower density, but still relatively high density, but kind of houses within kind of wider areas and with their own co-working hubs. So you might get someone who works full time for themselves, working 3 or 4 days from a local co-working hub, and then getting the train in and coming to a kind of co-working space in the centre of London to have a business meeting. We're seeing that kind of thing a lot. And so, traditional office is definitely shifting, but you're also seeing employers, ourselves included, really trying to upgrade the quality of office space that you've got, so that you've got outdoor space, that you've got things, because coming back to my previous point, which was about having kind of good environments and sort of biodiversity. All of those things are kind of an important factor for people now. Why would they come into the office? Well, we as employers want them to come in because actually we think they're more efficient. Actually, so creating better office environments. So there's quite a big market now in reimagining office space, either as different uses like hotels, etc., or actually just making it better rather than cramming in 500 desks into a space. It's sort of, actually, how can we create a really positive work environment? And the staff may only come in 3-4 days a week, say. So there's less need for actual desks, but more need for kind of communal meeting space, workshop space, that type of thing. So yeah, there's a big shift definitely happening, and I don't think we've seen the end of it. We're not quite sure, where it's going to go in the next 10-15 years. It'll be interesting to see.
And when you plan residential buildings, is there a shift on like apartment sizes, apartment mixes? So I think before COVID, we were like at a point where we were creating smaller apartments and more like common rooms within a residential building. I don't know if now we're back at making bigger apartments with home office spaces, or even more common rooms for residential buildings, like co-working or anything?
Yeah, so we're doing a number of co-working schemes. So yeah, there's different ends of the market. So yeah, co-living, and there's lots of different products, as they call them, the co-living market. Traditionally, young people, I don't know, Londoners, I know it best, come to London and they can't afford to buy a house here. It's extremely expensive. So they will they'll can rent a co-living space that might have shared amenities and the rest of it, and there's a huge number of those that are coming up around London. Some local authorities and government don't like them because they see them as a kind of slightly substandard housing product. I don't think that has to be the case. It is sometimes the case, but I think there's many really, really good schemes. I personally lived in Hackney Wick, which is a kind of big kind of artist community for years, where I shared with 14 other people in a massive old warehouse space. It was great. I loved, and we didn't have, a house. We had like rooms within a big space, and we could build things, make things, watch films together. It was fantastic. So I think there's a lot of that stuff happening. Also, at the other end of the age group, you're getting elder living products, as they call them. So for older people, there's kind of and this is quite older buildings that are often quite nice, converting them, making them really energy efficient so the bills aren't high. And then people that maybe had a 5-bed family home don't need it anymore and would like 2 beds or to have a room that their daughter or their friends can come and stay, but they don't want the hassle, and they might want to release money to their children or whatever. You're seeing a number of different kind of corporate players coming into that and looking at that. I think that's a really interesting area and can be really nice because you could try and create different types of communities with shared spaces and everything else. In terms of kind of what we call traditional resi houses and flats and that type of thing, a while ago now, probably 10, 15, maybe about 15 years ago, they reintroduced minimum standards for houses in the UK. So the National Design Standards and the London Plan, and that's really increased the sizes of houses and flats in the UK. There's pushes on that. I mean, some people say that's part of the reason why we're not building enough and they're not affordable. And there has been moves to create what's called permitted development. So old offices and things, they've allowed to be converted without having to meet minimum standards. And that's been quite controversial. So but it also brings more housing stock into the market. So you're seeing a lot of different things. You're getting these elder living products where maybe much smaller spaces, but great amenities. And then you're getting the kind of more traditional resi. But in London for sure, although it's picking up a bit this year with kind of, interest rates are beginning to come down, inflation's beginning to come down, which has been really making the housing market difficult because companies and the government haven't had much money effectively, or it's more expensive to borrow and more expensive to build, which makes some schemes unviable. They haven't been building as many big houses. Like that market's been weak, or relatively weak in the UK, although you're seeing some pick up in 2024.
Jon, I have one last question for you. In a city context, could you share with me your vision for the future of urban living and why it's essential to create cities that are not only sustainable, but also inclusive and healthy for everyone?
Yeah, it's a big question, but one I'm very passionate about. So I guess in Zurich and London and kind of developed cities, we have a kind of responsibility to kind of push forward to show best practice, even though the cities that are going to have the biggest impact on our future are in the developing world, or maybe have only just started being built up at the moment. But I think we're looking at quite dense cities in central areas with highly developed transport infrastructure, much less cars, very few cars, improved cycle infrastructure, increased biodiversity. You're finding cities now sometimes have higher biodiversity than the countryside in the UK because there's not the pesticides and other issues that are killing insects and other animals. So really areas that have kind of lots of green, less cars, more dense. And then I think what you want to see is in the countryside, controversially, I think you probably have, obviously you need areas that are growing food and productive, but I think I'm a big advocate for rewilding and looking at some of the areas in the kind of uplands in the UK and, where they're relatively poor agricultural land, not that productive, not that profitable, and actually returning that to growing trees and more traditional kind of it's old use. So a lot of even in Scotland, there's big initiatives on this, and in the kind of the north of England, down in Devon, to kind of rewild kind of areas and actually bring nature back, so that that we're putting something back. We keep taking away. We keep taking things out of the ground and burning things. So I think we need to reimagine that. That doesn't mean people won't live in those places. I think some people in the countryside feel very threatened by this idea, but I think it's that they are going to be more focused on environmental stewardship and greening, and you'll get people living there in less dense quantities. And in the cities, hopefully they'll be greener, very dense, lots of work happening, lots of interesting things happening. So yeah, I think a vision of greener cities and a greener, wilder countryside would be something I'd really love to see.
Oh, me too. Thank you so much, Jon. If our listeners want to follow your work and see what you're doing, where can they find you?
Check out our website, www.akroydlowrie.com, or follow us on LinkedIn. We've got quite an active LinkedIn. And the Urban Forecast podcast is an interesting one to watch. Myself and my business partner, Oliver Lowrie, present that and talk to some interesting people. So check out the Urban Forecast.
I'll definitely link it in the description.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and wish you the best of luck.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at Ladina Schöpf. Thanks.